Well, thank you, folks, and good afternoon. I hope everyone is enjoying the conference. My name is Jorge González-Gallarza. I'm the Executive Director of Fundación Civismo, right-of-center think tank in Madrid, and I co-host the Uncommon Decency podcast, and I'm delighted to be the moderator of this big freedom debate. Now, if you've been around this conference the last couple of days, you've probably realized that this is a conference predicated on the reactive notion of defending freedom from its enemies. And in fact, throughout history, the different strands of right-wing thought have indeed coalesced in opposition to a common enemy, whether that be the New Deal in America, or labor mismanagement of the economy in Britain, or international communism throughout the Cold War. Libertarians, conservatives, and a whole host of shades of thought in between have had to put aside their differences in the interest of defeating a common enemy. Yet every time the right has won power, in Europe and in America, it is realized that sharing a common enemy is simply not enough. The right, every time that it has won power, has realized the need to get beyond its aversion to big government and to advance a positive vision of the future that all of its component factions can get behind. This has been easier said than done, and I want to offer a couple of quotes from the year 1980, which is a really important year for our movement. It's the year when we were on the cusp of winning power in Britain and America. And that year, the conservative sociologist Robert Nisbet wrote in a very famous essay for Modern Age that libertarians and conservatives were uneasy cousins. Now, Russell Kirk, who was a lot less kind to libertarians, spoke of them as chirping sectaries. And he wrote in a very famous essay that to talk of forming a coalition between libertarians and conservatives is like advocating a union of ice and fire. Now, much the same applies to Europe, where different sensibilities are also having to join forces in order to defeat a soulless technocracy in Italy or a quasi-socialist far-left government in Spain. And today I'm delighted to moderate a debate that will pitch self-identifying members of 4 different ideological families of the European right in an effort to try to delineate the common ground on which we stand and to identify our differences. I'm going to start introducing our speakers in turn. I'm going to ask them to come join me on stage one by one, and then I'll be asking of them an opening speech. So introducing first John O'Sullivan, who will be speaking on behalf of classical conservatism. Please join me on stage, John. Thank you. Now, John will be speaking on behalf of what our organizers have called classical conservatism, by which they likely meant fusionism, or the idea that social traditionalists and libertarians can get behind a big tent coalition. John really needs no introduction. He's been an esteemed fixture of the intellectual conservative movement since the 1970s. He has been a parliamentary sketch writer in Westminster. He has been editor of National Review. He wrote speeches for Prime Minister Thatcher. He was an editor at National Review, and he's now president of the Danube Institute in Budapest. Now, Professor Hannes Gissurarson, please join me on stage. Thank you. Professor Gissurarson teaches political science at the University of Iceland. He has written a truly astonishing number of books on political philosophy, comparative political economy, and the history of the Nordic welfare state. I guess I'll just cite maybe 2 of his most recent works. In 2020, he published with New Direction 24 Conservative and Liberal Thinkers, which you're probably even able to grab a copy at the entrance. And then I'm going to ask Federico Ottavio Reho to join me on stage. Federico, thank you for coming. Federico will be speaking on behalf of a uniquely European school of thought, which is Christian democracy. Federico serves as strategic coordinator and senior research officer at the Wilfred Martens Center in Brussels. The Wilfred Martens Center is the in-house think tank of the European People's Party, the EPP. Federico previously worked at the European Central Bank and at the European Parliament. He's a graduate of the London School of Economics and the Hertie School in Berlin, and is currently a Doctor of Philosophy candidate at Oxford. Now, last but not least, I want to ask Anna Wellisz to join me on stage. Anna will be speaking on behalf of National Conservatism, or NADCON in short. Anna is the Vice President of External Affairs at the Edmund Burke Foundation, which is the group that has been putting on the NatCon series of conferences on both sides of the Atlantic since 2016. Previously, Anna was a senior director of the White House Writers Group, and she has taught literature, persuasive writing, and business communications at Berkeley and the Keller Graduate School of Management. So again, folks, I will just remind everyone of the format we will be following. I'm going to take a seat and ask each of our speakers in turn, and I really like how they sat in the exact same order that I'll be asking them to come deliver their opening statements, after which I will be asking a few questions of them, and then I'll turn to you and ask you for your questions to them. So without further ado, John, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jorge. I'm calling the conservatives I'm defending, by the way, unhyphenated conservatism rather than classical conservatism, but we'll see they probably match up well. Now, at a 1930s cocktail party in London, the famous conductor, Sir Thomas Beecham, was talking to a pleasant middle-aged lady whom he vaguely recognized, but whose name he just couldn't recall. He listened hard for clues as to who she was, but she gave nothing away, and eventually he fell back on an old gambit. "What's your husband doing these days?" he asked. "Oh," she replied pleasantly, "he's still king." Now, like Sir Thomas, we need to be reintroduced to ideas which we dimly recall, but whose power and authority we have forgotten. And one of those ideas is conservatism itself. What is it, and why is it in such dire straits? I'll begin in America. When the so-called new conservatism of William Buckley and Russell Kirk in the 1950s emerged, it came in for a great deal of wandering criticism. Was this mixture of anti-communism, moral traditionalism, and libertarian economics worthy of the name conservative? In particular, they provoked an essay on conservatism as an ideology in the American Political Science Review by Professor Samuel Huntington, more famous recently as the prophet of the Clash of Civilizations. He looked at three eruptions of conservative thought in European history. For instance, Burke's response to the French Revolution. And against those, he examined three different theories of conservatism. He argued that conservatism was not a narrowly specific ideology, justifying, for example, aristocratic resistance to the French Revolution. After all, Burke had defended not only feudal French institutions, but also commercial English and Indian princely ones with the same conservative arguments. Nor was it an autonomous system of ideas of universal validity, such as order, balance, and moderation, which any intelligent person might embrace, because it didn't appear in history all the time, or even randomly, but only at times of great political upheaval. Conservatism, he concluded, was that system of ideas that employed to defend established institutions when they came under fundamental attack. As he himself put it, when the foundations of society are threatened, the conservative ideology reminds men of the necessity of some institutions and the desirability of the existing ones. The impulse to conservatism comes from the social challenge before the theorist, not the intellectual tradition behind him. Applying that logic to the fusionism of Frank Meyer, Bill Buckley, and the rest, Huntington argued, in effect, that it was only half a conservatism. The new conservatives, who were mainly concerned to oppose international communism as a fundamental threat to America's institutions, he could endorse. The international communist threat was real, and so was the conservatism opposing it. Domestically, however, he doubted that America, under its 50s liberal dispensation, he thought it was in such a state of prosperous contentment that there was no real social challenge to existing institutions, and therefore the conservatives were left flailing at ideological windmills, not at real enemies. But this political peace, he thought, wouldn't last long. America's liberal institutions would soon come under radical attack, and then liberals would emerge to defend them with conservative arguments. That was a remarkably prescient forecast. A decade later, the 60s radicals issued a comprehensive denunciation of the reigning American liberalism and its central institutions, particularly the university, as oppressive. Many liberals immediately capitulated and embraced the radical critique as their own. But a minority of university liberals rejected it forcefully, developed a politics built around defending liberalism against the radical challenge, and neoconservatism was born. The neoconservatives were very quickly subsumed into a wider conservatism that included libertarians, moral traditionalists, cultural conservatives, and nationalists. Paradoxically, then, one early and important result of the 60s revolution was to push the United States into developing and adopting the varied and sophisticated conservatism that won the 1980 election and the Cold War. With socialist economics discredited by the Soviet collapse in 1989, the social democratic left embraced the market economy, made itself respectable, and occupied territory that used to belong to the right. From that moment on, with nothing solid to fight against, no real threat, conservatives had nothing particular to say. In response, many conservatives on the center-right ceased gradually to become conservative at all. I would suggest that's true of the German Christian Democrats and a lot of the parties in the EPP. After all, that's why you exist in large part. But just as the French Revolution was preceded by a long period in which the ancient regime was subjected to philosophical criticism, but not to serious political attack, in that way, left progressive critiques of Western democracy spread throughout cultural and other institutions until quite suddenly, yesterday in fact, they are now being enforced comprehensively in business, technology, the media, the courts, and everywhere except directly elected and accountable institutions. So the next great challenge to which conservatives must respond is the gradual undermining of majoritarian democracy based on the consent of the governed, and the shift of power and decision-making from institutions that are accountable to the people and those accountable to no one but themselves. We see this challenge across the First World in three developments: the shift of power from legislatures to bureaucratic agency and the courts, brought about by overgovernment; the shift of power from nation-states to supranational bodies under political and legal globalism; and the development of anti-democratic ideas that, lagging behind these events, have advanced late in the day to justify the relatively recent political practices and to defend the new loci of power. So in that ascending order, first, almost all Western countries are today governed by a regulatory state which daily manufactures what are in effect new laws, determining such matters as the amount of lead in car emissions, the proper ethnic and gender composition of a workforce, and the level of rents in New York City. We have become so used to the regulatory state that although we still notice its illiberal features, we no longer think of it as being offensive to democratic principles. But it is. So conservatives should constantly underline the weak democratic credentials of delegated legislation, point out how arbitrary and oppressive it can be, and where possible, offer alternatives. For example, protecting the environment by a greater use of civil law on property rights. Though regulation will not be halted by such opposition, it might be kept within democratic bounds and so reduced and restrained. Don't suppose, however, that judicial review is a remedy to regulatory government. If judges gradually acquire the power not only to overturn existing laws, but also to make new laws under the guise of constitutional review, they will inevitably abuse that power in time, and obviously are already doing so. Introducing same-sex marriage by legal legerdemain is just one example. Second, the shift of power inherent in the weakening of democratic national sovereignty. Supranational organizations like the EU are hostile to national sovereignty in principle, the UN also. They bind member states to accept majority decisions on matters that are unknowable in advance. They accept opt-outs from collective decisions only on a temporary basis. They are hostile to rules like the unanimity principle, and they mount obstacles to states that want to exit from them. In effect, they make the nation state into their agent on such matters as they see fit. Joining them inevitably becomes a loss of sovereignty. If democracy is intimately bound up with the nation state, as it plainly is, then organizations whose decisions must be ratified by national parliaments in a general, not purely theoretical sense, can lay claim to democratic accountability at one remove. The same claim cannot be made by bodies whose decisions are binding upon the parliaments of member states, so that at present, under a democratic facade, Europe is becoming a multilingual, multicultural empire ruled by remote and unsympathetic bureaucratic elites, not unlike India under the British Raj. Now, the two challenges to democracy I've discussed so far are anti-democratic in effect rather than in intent. But an ideology justifying them on grounds of principle has come limping along behind them. Indeed, at the very moment when some observers were declaring that Western democracy no longer faced a plausible ideological competitor in world politics, an intellectual challenge has emerged that quite self-consciously attacks democracy's central ideas while also claiming them. It calls itself post-democracy. That challenge has several names, starting with multiculturalism, going on to cultural Marxism, critical race theory, gender ideology, but we commonly now call it wokeness. Wokeness is an attempt to replace the system of liberal democracy based on individual citizens operating under laws and through voluntary organizations with a system of cultural democracy in which the fundamental units are distinct peoples, ethnic groups, and cultural blocs with their own worldviews, values, histories, heritages, and languages. By denying the legitimacy of the nation state, it undermines the only polity in which democracy flourishes without prescribing a democratic alternative. By asserting that a national common culture is oppressive to minorities, it denies the possibility of a national community to which people of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds have assimilated, and in which they can understand each other in free and democratic political debate. And by declaring majority rule inadequate or obsolete, they justify transferring power and policy making to elite minorities, such as judges, bureaucrats, international lawyers, and state bodies. And we are seeing today that if you give non-democratic institutions the power to restrain democracy, they will eventually use it to correct democracy. It is in the nature of unaccountable power to be abused. We have to accept here that we conservatives have been mistaken in the past in thinking that judicial and other elites would confine themselves to prudently dampening the passions of the mob. Those elites turn out to have passions of their own, indeed to be mobs of their own. And by and large, those passions are not shared by either the people nor by conservatives. They are the rationalizing and leveling passions that Burke diagnosed and excoriated 2 centuries ago, and they are a greater threat to liberty than the opinions of the mass of voters who, being closer to the realities of life and its hardships, have a greater sense of reality. Of course, like all such grandiose ideologies, wokeness cannot ultimately succeed, but it can cause a great deal of damage in the course of failing. We have to mount a vigorous and principled opposition to the anti-democratic ideas that lie at the root of wokeness. The stakes are high. Either we retain a vigorous democratic policy, or we find ourselves living in a bureaucratic, stifling state in which all our wants and desires may be provided for, but they won't include liberty and a democratic debate that actually influences the outcome of politics. And that outcome is not impossible. Many social forces are pushing us towards it. It's in disguise, of course. We can now throw back to Marx one of his most famous remarks with an amendment: socialism, like history, repeats itself. The first time as genocide, the second time as therapy. Now, my final point, Mr. Page there. Yes, what are the advantages of my unhyphenated conservatism to the amiable heresies promulgated by my opponents? I will mention just these. Unhyphenated conservatism is sympathetic to all the singular conservative positions advanced here, but also aware of their limitations. Libertarianism, for instance, needs order and authority, both external in law and internal in moral self-restraint, if it's not to degenerate into chaos, anarchy, libertinism, and family breakdown. Christian democracy has great difficulty in defending its main moral message in a post-Christian society. Its insistence that it's a centrist rather than a conservative party leaves it philosophically rudderless, and it gradually declines into being merely a social support group for social democracy. Classical liberalism lacks enough social support to survive unaided without being attached to a broader social conservatism. Nationalism is not itself a philosophy, it's an admirable disposition, love of country. It needs, therefore, to be attached to deeper and wider truth, which is why Anna is defending national conservatism. Conservatism provides all of these partial truths with a balanced and unifying justification that can win support for the entire coalition. It is the most realistic of the positions here. Second, unhyphenated conservatism provides answers to social crises in a way that the other ideas do not. As I argued, that is its main drive. Between crises, I'm afraid it sometimes goes into a light hibernation, and that's the main problem for it. But it's the main opportunity for the rest of the people on the platform. They can fill the gap with their ideas. And conservatism, finally, is able to manage the logical divisions between the various conservative factions because it sympathizes with all of them, but recognizes that all of them have limitations. And in that, it mirrors the conservative electorate, which happily ignores such divisions at election time and most other times, because it recognizes a fundamental sympathy uniting the right, even when they disagree about this or that. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the case for unhyphenated conservatism.
Thank you, John, for this sweeping defense of unhyphenated conservatism. And this is a really good way to set up the tables for our debate, as each of our speakers are going to be diverging from the principles that John has just outlined in their own specific ways. Professor Hannes, please deliver your opening statement.
Ladies and gentlemen, in fact, I think that not only is an alliance between conservatives and classical liberals necessary, but I also believe that there is a consistent, logical, and strongly supported theory, political theory, on which this fusion or this alliance is based. And I write about it in my book, which was published by New Direction, 24 Conservative Liberal Thinkers, where I identify 4 pillars of the free society: private property, free trade, limited government, and respect for tradition. And I identify 24 thinkers. I would actually add more now, having studied it further, including St. Thomas Aquinas, who was in many ways a liberal, offering a classical liberal, offering a cogent defense based on Aristotle of private property. And Aquinas, of course, also told us to stay not only out of the boardroom, but also out of the bedroom. Because he said in the Summa Theologica, man is a sinner, and the law should only pursue those sins of his which are harmful to other people. And leave alone, not condone, but leave alone those sins that are not harmful to other people. And I think this is a much more sensible approach than that of John Stuart Mill in the 19th century. And other conservative liberal thinkers would include David Hume and Adam Smith and Edmund Burke, an admirable thinker, a classical liberal, thinking in economic affairs just the same as Adam Smith and David Hume, with whom he corresponded. And then we have Alistair de Tocqueville, who provided what John O'Sullivan found wanting in classical liberalism, which is really the social context, the flourishing civil society that has to stand between the individual and the state. And Ludwig von Mises, who refuted socialism conclusively, and Michael Oakeshott, Benedict Juvenel, and others. But I must confess that the greatest thinker, in my opinion, in the conservative liberal tradition is Friedrich von Hayek. Hayek posed a fundamental question, which is, how is it that we, knowing so little, each of us, can achieve so much together, build up Western civilization with its variety, diversity, entrepreneurship, creativity, freedom? Why is this possible? His answer is that in a free society, under the rule of law, we are able to avail ourselves of knowledge that we do not possess ourselves. And this knowledge is of two kinds. One is the knowledge that is transmitted from one generation to another, the wisdom of our ancestors. It's knowledge transmitted in time between generations. The other one is the knowledge transmitted in space through this price mechanism and competitive pressures on us. So it is the use of knowledge which enables us to extend our powers and to build up this impressive civilization that we support and we defend. Now, that would really also become an interesting question, what we should then say about the new trends today, nationalism and populism. Hayek would actually have been quite critical of both of them. I wouldn't be. I think we have to distinguish between good and bad nationalism. Good nationalism is the collective will to share a state and some history and even language with somebody else based on our heritage. It is a collective reaffirmation of our identity, good nationalism. It is the good nationalism that, for example, made the Baltic countries become independent, claim sovereignty. The Estonians, they're not Russians, they didn't want to be Russians. The Finns didn't want to be Russians either. The Icelanders in 1918 became a sovereign state because they were not Danes. They were friendly to the Danes. We learned a lot from the Danes. We were lucky to have them as our colonial masters. But we were not Danes. We were Icelanders. We spoke Icelandic. We shared a history of 1100 years, and we wanted to affirm this and to protect our collective identity. And the same applies to the Poles, to the Hungarians, and many others. So there is nothing wrong with that nationalism, but it has to be the nationalism that Ernest Renan, the very well-known French historian, called daily plebiscite. It has to be nationalism by choice. It should only be our home, not a prison nor a fortress, the nation. Bad nationalism, however, is the aggressive, militant nationalism or imperialism that seeks to subdue other nations and humiliate them. And we see actually the conflict between the good and the bad nationalism today close to us, because we have now Russian imperialism, the bad nationalism, fighting and attacking Ukrainian nationalism, the good nationalism, because the Ukrainian nationalism is really the reaffirmation of the will of the Ukrainian nation to be a nation and to maintain a sovereign state. I also think that we have to make a distinction between positive and negative populism. My political heroes, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, they were populists in the good sense of the word. They were building up constituencies, voters for their own ideas and ideals. They were looking for ways in which the private interest of the voters could coincide with the public interest. A very good example of this is how Mrs. Thatcher sold the council houses in the United Kingdom. She turned the tenants, who didn't care much about the houses, into house owners who felt responsibility. And the same, of course, with the share-owning democracy that she promoted. She wanted to turn everybody into an owner, a responsible owner, somebody who would have a stake in society and its survival. So I think that kind of populism is perfectly compatible with the conservative liberalism that I have been speaking about. But there is also the negative populism, and that's quite different, because that is when demagogues, they single out a part of the population, either inside the country or somewhere else, and make them into an enemy. The Jews, under the National Socialists, and the rich, according to the left-wingers. And I would criticize and reject completely that kind of populism. I'm perfectly willing to discuss further in the question and answers period conservative liberalism, but I would only end with saying this. John O'Sullivan correctly pointed out that conservative sentiments are strengthened when our established institutions are being threatened. And now, not only established institutions are being threatened, but the whole of Western civilization. And we must never forget that freedom is a fragile flower, and it needs to be fought for. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor, for that defense of classical liberalism. I'm going to ask Federico now to come deliver his opening statement. Speaking on behalf of Christian democracy.
Yeah, which was the most heavily attacked of the movement so far. Look, I was, first of all, I mean, thank you very much for the invitation to the organizers to New Direction. I am happy to be here with you, but I am also particularly happy, I say it very frankly, that finally we talk, if I can be open. I think for a long time it was not very easy, but I have always have had a spirit of collaboration among the different factions of the center-right. So it is important that we have occasions and forums in which we can exchange, we can know each other better, we can explore where we agree, where we disagree, where we can potentially collaborate, where we can't. So I think this is commendable, and I'm all for it. Now, I was hoping that we would take our gloves off during the second round, but I have seen that they have already gone off pretty quickly. So I am a little bit torn if I should not start with some rebuttals. Let me maybe begin with two sort of initial caveats or disclaimers before I go briefly into some thoughts or rebuttals. The first is that the organizations that I am somehow affiliated with, that is the Martin Center for European Studies and the European People's Party, are not, strictly speaking, Christian democratic or purely Christian democratic organization. That's an important point to make. We speak a lot about fusionism here, rightly. Well, let's not forget that the EPP has started in the 1990s an experiment which I would define of incomplete and maybe partly aborted fusionism, meaning that it has consciously decided to transform itself from what it was at its foundation, which is essentially an international of Christian democratic parties, into a pan-European party of the center-right, in which the three main ideologies that we are discussing here, conservatism, Christian democracy, and classical liberalism, not quite national conservatism, which wasn't around anyway back then, or certainly wasn't that prominent, could find a common home and maybe develop with time a fusionist doctrinal synthesis. That's the first caveat that I would like to make. We can discuss to what extent that was successful. I think it was a very interesting experiment as long as the EPP-ED group in the European Parliament lasted, so until 2008 and 9. Then for a number of reasons that experiment collapsed. We can discuss why. I think there are good, it's an interesting discussion to have, but that's beyond the topic now. My second caveat is that I will try to represent orthodox standard Christian democracy, but probably I myself, I am a rather unorthodox Christian Democrat for the reasons I was saying, because the EPP is a very broad church, and it's a partly fusionist party. I am one of the Italian translators of Hayek. I have done a lot of work on Hayekian federalism, the application of Hayekian concepts to the problems of European integration. So I could be, I could label myself a classical liberal. I am writing a dissertation on the Holy Roman Empire as a conservative symbol of order. So I can very comfortably claim to be a conservative. And my main policy work is about how to articulate a robust notion of subsidiarity in Europe that can give shape to a Christian democratic and conservative idea of Europe that is alternative to the centralism of the left. So again, I can call myself a Christian Democrat. So I am a living embodiment in a way of the fusionism that we are seeking here, or that we are discussing here. Now, very briefly on the rebuttals. I mean, John, to be frank, your hyphenated conservatism strikes me as singularly unconservative in many regards. I'll just raise a few points for the debate, and then I quickly have to go into Christian democracy. It seems to me that, first of all, a certain anti-majoritarianism was part and parcel of the Christian democratic, conservative beliefs throughout the 19th and most of the 20th centuries. It is us who constructed most of the checks and balances and the independent institutions that you are now so heavily and partly rightly, I think, criticizing. It was Margaret Thatcher, a leader whom you knew well, who said that referendums are devices of dictators and demagogues. And therefore showed that she was clearly in this tradition of conservatism that prized checks and balances, even when occasionally, temporarily, they favored the opposite camp. So that's my first point. It is a very conservative idea. It was us who built the system very largely. There is a wonderful book by Marco Duranti, which I recommend you to read. It's a serious historical work published by Oxford University Press, which recounts the conservative origin of the European Convention on Human Rights. The conservative human rights revolution, of all things, was written largely and framed by conservatives because, for example, British conservatives were worried that a Labour victory in the UK might undermine property rights and therefore wanted to lock in the protection of these property rights at the supranational level. French conservatives were worried that the very heavy secularist trends in France might undermine the independence of Catholic schools. So they decided to create a chart, a European chart, which in their also historical imagination, they imagined a bit as a neo-medieval, chart that would regulate the rights of everybody in Christendom as a supranational body. That's the origin of the European Convention on Human Rights. I agree with you that there has been a degeneration. There has been a degeneration. I think so. I think that, for example, in terms of judicial interpretation, you can study and trace these things. There was something beautifully called the doctrine of appreciation, for example, in the jurisprudence of the European Court on Human Rights, which left a significant degree of freedom to for national, differentiations and cultural differentiation to be protected. And that has been progressively thrown out of the window. But I don't think this can be a criticism, a structural criticism of the system of checks and balances at the national level and the supranational governance as such. It can be a criticism of certain distortions that intervened in the last decades and that we conservatives, Christian Democrats, had to fight to redress, and probably are not fighting enough to redress, particularly Christian Democrats, I recognize that. But it is not helpful to take an anti-systemic posture that is so radical that prevents any hypothesis for collaboration, because what are you going to do? I mean, how can you collaborate on the basis of overhauling the whole system? It's a rather unconservative, it seems to me, approach to the problem at hand. The US Supreme Court is good when it introduces gay marriage in 2016. I don't agree with that. I think it was a misguided decision, also based on legal grounds. But it is also the same court, ultimately, that rightly, I think, legislated recently to return the rights of abortion to the states. So why? Because meanwhile, conservatives took some measures. You know, they redressed some of the distortions, but the independence of the court is there, is respected, is not touched. Okay, I would have many more things to say, and I'm a bit thorn there too. Even Europe, sorry, I mean, maybe last point on the rebuttals. Even Europe is a conservative cause. I mean, Burke spoke about the Commonwealth of Europe. The Commonwealth of Europe. Edmund Burke, the founder of conservatism. Metternich, the founder of continental conservatism, wrote, I consider Europe my fatherland. So there is in the DNA of conservatism, we don't need to get to the Christian democratic founding fathers of Europe or to the conservative founding fathers of Europe. Have we forgotten our Winston Churchill? Have we forgotten even Art de Gaulle, who was a confederalist, but he was certainly in favor of a strong European unity. Read the Fouché Plan, you know, that's a very advanced proposal for military integration. So I think that we are a little bit off track. We are throwing away the baby with the bathwater. I also don't agree, Hannes, with your distinction between good and bad nationalism, good and bad populism. I think we are quibbling here a little bit. But again, maybe I can come back to that later.
Yeah.
So let's get to Christian democracy. Now, first of all, what are we talking about? It's clear that to pin down Christian democracy is more difficult than to pin down probably liberalism and conservatism. Liberalism is about ultimately liberty. It has a theory of history, I think, that is based on progress. Here, Professor Ludgutfo has written very interesting and I think things that we can all share. Conservatism has traditions at its core, and the theory of organic change defines this sort of philosophy of history. What about Christian democracy? And I think that the short answer is Christianity, particularly Catholic Christianity, is to Christian democracy what probably freedom is to liberalism and traditions are to conservatism. And if I have to say it shortly, I think the historic purpose of Christian democracy has been, I'm now paraphrasing Woodrow Wilson, to make democracy safe for Christianity. Because Christian democracy accepted the challenge of modernity in a Tocquevillian spirit as inevitable. You know that the opening chapters of Democracy in America, Tocqueville famously say that democracy is a force that we cannot resist. Christian democracy shared that notion, believed that liberal modernity is here, we need to cope with it. It is challenging for traditional Christian views and the role of the Catholic Church and the churches in general in our society. So it took up the challenge of making democracy safe for Christianity. And here is, you can see both a genetic connection between conservatism and Christian democracy, which to an extent are sister movements in their genesis because they are both oppositional movements to liberal modernity in their origins. But you can also see a difference in method. You know, conservatism, John, you quoted William F. Buckley Jr. In a famous quip, he said, conservatism is about standing athwart history yelling stop. So the method of conservatism is an oppositional method. The method of Christian democracy is an infiltrating method. Christian democracy, ride the waves, and trying to infiltrate and reshape the process from within, directing it to Christian ends, and making it compatible with a providential view of history.
Federico, I want to make sure there's time for Anna, so try to be brief and just a couple more minutes and we'll turn to Anna.
Okay. Yeah. So what am I trying to get at here? That the method of Christian democracy tends to be a search for moderation, for compromise, for balance. And I'll give you 3 examples of core Christian democratic principles that show this ability of Christian democracy to bridge divides and to often third ways between polar opposites in a way that I think the other, let's say, traditions represented here are less capable of. Conservatism is a much more confrontational body. The first is personalism, the second is subsidiarity, the third is the social market economy. These are all core Christian democratic principles, which I think represent rather successful attempts to offer third ways between polar opposites. Personalism is a third way between individualism and holism, if you want. And in this sense, it is a theory of society which perceives the individual not as an atomized entity, but as embedded in its social relations and fulfilling itself through its social relations. So in this sense, you can see that it is a theory that is alternative both to the most radical liberal ideas of individuals as atoms, but also to socialist ideas of holism. And in this sense, it is close to conservatism. I think conservatism doesn't formulate it in this way, but it has a similar theory of society. Subsidiarity, the idea that the higher power should be there to help the lower power fulfill itself, develop itself, and not to encroach upon its autonomy and prerogatives. That's a third way between things like localism and centralism. Talking about nationalism, how much nationalism was a progressive force in the history of Europe. Nationalism was embraced by the most radical modernizers in the 19th century. It dislocated heavily all local ecosystems. It dislocated heavily the international system in Europe. So what is conservative about nationalism? And subsidiarity is also the foundation of, I think, the Christian democratic view of an integrated Europe. And we can talk more about that later. Last point, the social market economy. The social market economy is an attempt to combine the embrace of free market economics. We were discussing with Hannes before, Wilhelm Röpke, Ludwig Erhard. These were all free market economists who have read Mises, who have read Hayek, they were friends with Hayek, many of them, but also to add some correctives in the direction of a basic safety net for those who cannot participate in the competitive process, and a strong state that would enforce competition. So again, this ability of Christian democracy to represent a third way. Last point can I make?
Last point.
Yeah, and this is my conclusion really. I think that this is probably the key contribution that Christian democracy can still make, because we live in very polarized and tribalized society. I think Christian democracy with its method, which looks for compromise while advancing conservative values in constructive ways, and if concrete Christian democracy in the EPP has been able to do that concretely, we can discuss. I have my own criticisms on that, but I think this is the main virtue of Christian democracy, and also it is interesting for our purposes because this attitude makes it very fusionist in spirit. And I stop here and we can discuss more later.
Thank you, Anna. And speaking on behalf of National Conservatism. Thank you. And we'll have, and I would appreciate any and all gestures from the organizers if we can go beyond the allotted time.
I'll try to be quick since we're about 10 minutes behind. Well, first, okay, I'm going to try to not make it about rebuttal because I think that's what our discussion was supposed to be about. So I'll try to sort of respond and present what I came here to present, national conservatism. So first with John's unhyphenated conservatism, I second it. And in fact, national in NatCon is only stating the obvious. We are a world of nations. That is all we're trying to remind everybody, just to make it very clear. This is not about the sort of nationalism that, well, we'll get to it, but that's literally all it is. It's about the world in which people love their nations, their families, their kids, their congregations, and they relate to the rest of the world from that perspective. So in a way, national conservatism is almost a tautology. I mean, conservatism is naturally and necessarily local. It has a time, it has a place, and it comes from a tradition. So it's sort of like Catholic before Christianity. Of course, Christianity is universal, so Catholic in a way is a tautology. Now, about liberalism, And this, I'm going to try to also define what we are about in responding to it. Liberal conservatism failed to confront the rise and triumph of the modern self, to quote Truman's book title. The sexual ideologies, trans ideologies, everything that redefined the modern self beyond anything that we ever imagined. And as I think John said, that basically were created yesterday, and suddenly they are our core and foundational values. The other thing that liberalism failed to contain is woke capital. Capital that's against freedom, that's against all the things that made wealth creation possible, that's against allocation of wealth in a way that's efficient, which is the reason why we try to defend the free markets and let them function normally. They're actually not doing it. They're using their power to not allocate wealth rationally. And just a reminder, which is something that our brand of I think conservatism really is all about. And John and I and many others actually signed the same statement of principles, just so we know, and John actually was a co-author of it. But our rights and values, and this is something we want to remind everybody, we talk a lot about the markets and about the economics behind conservative principles. We don't really talk enough about values and the fact that our rights and our values did not jump out of our heads like Athena from Zeus. They did not come out of nowhere. They're not sort of pre-existing everything. They're coming from somewhere. They're coming from the Bible. We come from a certain tradition. We live in that tradition, and we happily, so happily, take it for granted that we're destroying it, not understanding that we're cutting off our own roots. That is actually, and it's not, I think, because we're being suicidal. I think because we're being delusional, and we think that we gave birth to those things of which we ourselves are born. And as far as the bad name of nationalism, to respond to the last critique, I truly, but nationalism is really nothing more than the love of the nation and of all things that your country is and represents. It's a nice, fuzzy, and warm feeling that you have when you listen to your national anthem, when you listen to a speech that somehow touches all the soft points in your soul. It's the things that make you want to, for instance, say to yourself that you're ready to become a nationalized citizen, to become a citizen in a country where you live, when you realize that you're not just functioning there, you're being moved by its symbols, you identify with them. And what I think is really important, and I have to say it because it's not said enough, and it's a source of a lot of errors, I think, in our thinking about not just nationalism, but also imperialism and globalism. Nationalism, bad name, comes from, above all, misinterpreting what imperialism is. Just because Adolf Hitler thought he was a patriot didn't make him not an imperialist. He was not a nationalist. He was an imperialist par excellence. You go after the land, you want to kill off the people who are there. There's nothing nationalist about fighting with hatred what's in front of you, rather than the love, defending with the love of what's behind you. It's a really important thing. What's also important about remembering that that is not nationalism is that interpretation indemnifies in a very clever way globalists and makes it very easy for them. We're not imperialists, we're internationalists. Suddenly, internationalists cannot be imperialists if you take that definition of nationalism. It is not true, it's inaccurate, and it's very convenient for the biggest imperialist threat we have right now, which is globalism. Apart from, of course, the rise of China and whatever Russia is doing, but there is nothing that we should assume that indemnifies globalists from being accused of imperialist tendencies, which their very aggressive impulse to homogenize, to make everything same, to deprive all of us of any sense of belonging to a place, is anything other than imperialism. So, and just for Christian democracy, just one thing that I wanted to add. You mentioned the triumph or the obvious success of Christian democracy. This is it sounds good, but it's a very theoretical judgment. The fact is that we lived in the world right now where Christianity is completely banished and, in fact, anathemized in the public square. In my mind, this is, forgive me, not personal, but it's a mark of a horrendous political failure. If we were living in a world in which those values are recognized and respected, that's a different story. And I guess this is where national conservatism, I'm watching the time, where conservatism, when national conservatism comes in, we're really about restoring and bringing back the beliefs, the institutions, and the liberties that are absolutely foundational for who we are. It's also a reminder that we're built on something, that there is something that needs to exist for the kinds of lives that we imagine we want to live, and that we lived actually for hundreds of years, however our systems evolved. Remember, nations precede the ways in which our states are organized. Nations and culture came first. It's something that John Paul II probably articulated most clearly, and did it for about 27 years, standing by nations that had the ambition to be free and to live while exercising their cultural sovereignty. And because these are the things that are being now progressively undermined and overthrown, we want to restore those first things, the foundations for defending and protecting what's under attack. So we want to bring back unapologetically and defend the tradition of independent, self-governed nations. I mean, can you imagine Germany trying to defend the national interest of Poland? Because, you know, we're all brothers and sisters. I don't think this is going to happen. I don't think anybody else other than Hungarians is going to represent the interests of Hungary. Frankly, I don't think anybody other than Germans is going to represent the interests of Germans, or the French, or Americans, or anybody else. We all have to do it ourselves. And we have to do it in a way that will make it possible for countries whose goodwill and good opinion we want to have, to make them want to have alliances with us. So we have an interest in being decent members of the international community. It's not true that if we pursue national interests, we necessarily become unreservedly selfish, evil, and we have a reason not to become that. Courage, honor, patriotism, religion, family, man, woman, raising a child, a sense of justice, all those things have to be brought back. And maybe, I mean, actually, gosh, I'm sorry, I should kind of rush through. Sorry.
We do want to leave some time perhaps for questions, so a few concluding remarks.
I'm just going to rush through. Just in terms of principles, and I'm not going to develop it because I'm going to eat up all the time that we were generously given. What we stand for, and again, I actually feel very comfortable without hyphenating, as long as we understand that conservatism is local, is national first. There is a child born in a family, family is in a community, community is in a nation, and the nation is in the human family. But we stand for national independence, self-government, not giving power to transnational institutions. We absolutely reject imperialism and globalism for the same reason. We believe, for the reasons for which John very well articulated, we do not want any divestment of power to supranational, unelected officials. It is not in the interest of anybody except for those officials who enjoy their power. We believe in the national government that's, as the preamble of the American Constitution says, exists to establish a more perfect union, provide for their common defense, justice among them, secure general welfare. So that just means a strong and limited state, constitutional restraint, division of power, representative legislature that will not be second-guessed by the judiciary and will not be second-guessed by administrative state. We believe in God and public religion in public life, again, because these are the sources of our values, not because we want to terrorize anybody or convert them. We do believe in freedom in your home to believe as you wish, except we do want the freedom to express those values publicly. We believe in the rule of law. We absolutely believe in the free enterprise, but let's not forget that economy based on private property and free enterprise is the only way we came up with so far to create wealth. At the same time, we don't want the private enterprise to work against the nation. We don't want our secrets to be given or sold to the Chinese. I mean, there were people who sold secrets to the Soviet Union, and they were called Rosenbergs. They were tried, and they were executed, and it was called treason at some point. We had that clarity. We lost that clarity. And we do not want, and that's again, Burke was mentioned. Oddly enough, Adam Smith wasn't. I can't believe that I'm the one who's mentioning him. But I assure you, if you read them, they have no problem with the pursuit of national interest. They had no problem with coming to terms with East India Company when it started acting like a sovereign and not like a merchant, much the way our big tech and transnational companies are now acting. And
just a few concluding thoughts, if you
yeah,
can.
I'm finishing. Maybe just, I already mentioned family and children. I will mention public research and the fact that our educational institutions cannot 24/7 for federal state money work to destroy the nations in which they're being funded, take money from hostile powers in order to pay for their social engineering schemes, because that is in fact how that works. The last thing is immigration requires assimilation. I'm an immigrant. I have 2 passports, so I actually know what I'm saying. I live by what I'm saying here. And the last matter is race, because any form of emphasis of the nation immediately meets, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, with criticism of racism. Nation is the biggest tent there is. Anybody, all men are created equal. Anybody who will say otherwise, anybody who will claim that our features, our color, our hair, anything is our essence, that should absolutely be illegal, whether it's the government or private institutions that are pursuing those policies. This was rushed, but I hope it made sense.
Thank you, Anna. I want to acknowledge the organizers who have graciously allowed us to go beyond the allotted time, and I have one question that can be answered by either John, Hannes, or Anna. A common theme across your presentations has been fusionism, the idea that liberals, classical liberals, and conservatives can come together and form a coalition to defeat No. I'm just saying it was part of it's obviously not. I mean, what the national conservative position has been rather to advocate for defusionism in Yoram's terms, right? To sort of decouple the social traditionalists from the economic liberals. Yoram has only says that fusionism is the process by which liberals have usurped the conservative label. What makes you think, John, that fusionism can still work 30 years after it was first tried in American Britain?
First, is that working? Yes. First of all, I wouldn't necessarily describe it as fusionism. I would say that there is such a thing as a coalition of political parties who recognize that although they have their differences, nonetheless, none of the constituent parties is the enemy of the others, in a way that undoubtedly the progressives are the enemies of everyone in the coalition, and this is a political reality. It's also a social reality. My own view is that if you look, and I mentioned this in a line, but if you look at conservative electorates, they don't have any difficulty in feeling that they are on one side of the political divide, particularly in two-party systems, rather than the other. Of course, they recognize that their own side is sometimes wrong or rash or whatever, but they don't stop supporting it. And in a proportional representation electoral systems, parties are far more likely to divide into one of the parties in the two-party system might be 3 or 4 parties in a PR system. But that then means that the parties present their policies to the electorate in a way that enables them to, in a sense, speak in purist ideological terms, which they then abandon in the post-electoral struggle. So I like the two-party system because it it encourages the coalitions, large coalitions, and they encourage a stable political order in the electorate. That is really, and I think that the people here are quite wise in recognizing the necessity of balance, compromise, change, and of course, even in a two-party system, there will be events. Brexit is possibly one, but they occur, I would say, once every 2 generations, in which a political issue is so divisive in one of the coalitions that some members of it break off and the coalitions reform. These things are not set in stone. They are responses of large portions of the electorate, as well as factions in the party, to political events. And that's one reason why, for example, and I'm afraid this is the issue on which we will really come to blows, I would say to my gentlemanly opponent in the Christian Democrats, I think modern conservatives have to take a stand on behalf of majoritarianism. It may be that it has to be a deliberative stand. Deliberative democracy was what Wilmore Kendall, the American political theorist, advocated. And there may be various steps which we confront people with the logical consequences of the policy they have voted for and ask them to think again. But I do not think that if we are serious about the consent of the governed, then we can choose any sort of minoritarianism, which is the opposite to majoritarianism, over majoritarianism.
Sure. Professor Gissurarson, I want to elaborate here on this question. Yoram Hazany, one of the arguments he puts forth for why he thinks there should be this diffusionism is he says that liberalism and conservatism are essentially at odds. They're two radically different philosophies. Liberalism posits that the human being is free and equal, and it starts its political philosophy from that premise, whereas conservatives understand human beings as being tied by the bonds of nation, family, congregation, tribe. What makes you think that the two are compatible? What makes you think that classical liberals and conservatives can come together and agree on anything?
Is this one working? Yes. I think actually that this philosopher is sparking up the wrong tree, because he is attacking a straw man. The conservative liberal tradition that I was trying to outline here puts special emphasis on the ties, attachments, and commitments that we have. It is not only about us choosing or consuming or producing in the economy. Conservative liberalism is about not only what you can have in your pocket, but also what kind of a person you are or aspire to be. Or in other words, we mustn't be like the economists who know the price of everything and the value of nothing. It is all about values. However, there is a difference between fully fledged conservatism and classical liberalism, I think, even if they can get together, and even if there is a branch of liberalism which is conservative, like I tried to describe. And I could identify two differences. One of them is that the pure conservatives, they don't believe in progress. They resist change. They don't welcome the entrepreneurship and creativity and disruption that Joseph Schumpeter called actually creative destruction. And whereas we welcome it. We think it is an adventure. We think that we are climbing up a mountain and we are seeing a greater vista, and we don't just want to stay in one place. Civilization is movement for movement's sake, as Hayek said. This is one difference. The other one is universalism. I'm afraid that some of my conservative friends in the United Kingdom, like John O'Sullivan, and I had this debate in Australia with Kenneth Minogue and John Gray, my old supervisor at Oxford, and they both believed very strongly in the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon literary heritage, and they thought that freedom was the product of a long evolution of Anglo-Saxon political insights, and somehow they were trying to exclude the rest of us from enjoying freedom. Whereas I think freedom is a universal value and that everybody is fit for freedom, and that accords very well with the Catholic doctrine of universitas hominum, the brotherhood of man, even if we recognize that we have much stronger obligations to our family and then to our nation than to the whole of the world. So that would be my response to that question.
Wonderful. I want to ask one question of each the two remaining panelists. Federico, you've one of the criticisms that is often leveled at Christian Democrats, right? Although you mentioned the EPP isn't necessarily made up of Christian Democrat parties, but Christian Democrats have been accused of having abandoned Christian democracy in favor of neoliberalism. In fact, when, for instance, when Prime Minister Viktor Orban took the Fidesz party out of the EPP, he argued he was doing so in order to remain a Christian democratic party. Why? What do you think? What do you think he got wrong? Why do you think should he have stayed in the EPP? Is the EPP still the home of conservative Christian Democrats?
Of course, the Orban issue. Can you hear me? Of course, I said the Orban issue was inevitable. Look, the premise there is that I was not among those who wished the matter to end as it ended. Let's put it this way. There was a minority in the EPP, I think, if you look at the final votes, mostly Italians, French, and some Central European delegations that were skeptical about the way this was going. But the fact of the matter, I think, is that Orban left the EPP because, let's start from the pragmatic level. The pragmatic reason, and then, I mean, Daniel and others can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the balance had shifted against him in the EPP group. He had lost support of particularly the Germans, who had been always very critical in defending him, the Bavarians, the CSU, and the CDU were about to vote after this change of rules in the EPP group in favor of a suspension or expulsion of Fidesz, which would have been a huge humiliation for Orban. So he decided to preemptively, understandably, move out of the EPP. This was the pragmatic reason. I think the fundamental issue was some of the issues that I and John a little bit partly addressed already. The bottom of the matter was illiberal democracy. I do not think it was conservative values, to be frank with you. The perception, rightly or wrongly, in important circles of the EPP, including by then the German EPP, was that this was going beyond the legitimate pursuit of conservative policies, that there was an embrace of illiberalism, of an extreme majoritarianism, a bit along the lines of what John said, and also for the reasons that he eloquently, put forward, in which you saw the undermining of the independence of the courts, a certain restriction of media pluralism, a university which, however, antagonistic towards the government, was a prestigious university and was forced to flee the country through League of Fudges. This was the perception. And this was the issue on which the matter was consummated, on the ground that this was a fundamental departure from Christian democratic principles, some of which I have elucidated. A certain anti-majoritarianism, a preference for conciliation and an avoidance of polarization. The least we can say about Viktor Orban is that he likes to polarize. And that had become a bit difficult to handle also internally. He kept attacking also EPP figures. So there was an issue of trust that was broken. There was an issue of systemic transformation of Hungary that was deemed problematic and incompatible with Christian democratic principles. But I don't want to evade the other side of the problem. Is the EPP and is the European Union blameless on the matter? I don't think so, frankly. Because I do think that as in Hungary, perhaps there is a tendency to advance conservative policies mixed with a new form of illiberal democracy, which is worrying for Christian Democrats for the reasons I explained. I think also on the European level, there is a tendency to conflate the protection of the rule of law in its procedural dimension, which I think is important and is necessary for the functioning of the single market, and it's something that a supranational union cannot work without it, meaning the independence of the courts, basic checks and balances, but this is constantly conflated, I think, in EU discourse with the most progressive interpretation of rights, for example, which have nothing to do, strictly speaking, with the rule of law. We are not obliged to impose on all member states the most progressive definition of Article 2 rights. There must be a margin of differentiation in which conservative countries must be able. Hungary wants to be a more conservative country than Sweden. It should be free to do it. I don't think it is a business of the EU to impose, requirement for gender issues in its financing. I don't think that it is correct that, for example, if a country decides to put God in its constitution and to ban gay marriage and to prohibit the representation of homosexuality to minors, these are things that you can agree or disagree with. But I think Christian Democrats should be principled enough, in the name of subsidiarity, to side against all this, which constantly happens in the European Parliament. And I think they have not been capable of doing that. And that's a criticism that I think is fair.
And I think that's reassuring. I want to conclude by giving Anna a chance to address, and this will be the final question, one of the main criticisms that has been leveled at the NatCon movement, which is that you support industrial policy, you support a higher degree of state intervention in the economy than has been the norm in previous areas of conservative politics. How do you respond to critics who say that the NatCons are sliding towards socialism?
Does it work? Oh. We're not. We're not socialists, and anybody who thinks that in the world in which crony capitalism is basically thriving on steroids are countries that do not pursue industrial policy. We support certain kinds of education. In the US, we subsidize and give loans and forgive loans, as we just found out, to people who go to college. We do not do the same thing for those who want to pursue trades. Why? Why would we pretend that that is not, in fact, a form of economic industrial policy? If you support somebody who studies, I'm not making it up, this is a real major, I'm sure it is in Europe now, but if you can get subsidies to study gay and lesbian studies, why is it that you are a socialist if you won't give somebody a stipend to go and learn from an electrician how to install some fancy equipment that a lot of kids have a knack for, but they're not very good in the classroom. So I actually think that, like with everything else, it's the narratives that are out there. It's what you call it. We do pursue economic policies. We have preferences for industries, for activities, and somehow, if it is as it is, it's fine. If somebody says, wait, maybe we shouldn't be giving money to woke universities, maybe we should give money to people who are going to be technicians, maybe not engineers, but technicians, that suddenly becomes some sort of violation of free market principles. Just a reminder, free market does not exist for free market alone. It exists for the people and for the nations in which it functions. We just want to remind of that.
Well, thank you. We're going to have to conclude. Maybe a few thoughts from John.
Well, I just wanted to respond on a couple of points. Earlier this year, I ran a conference in London designed to bridge the gap between Christian Democrats and Conservatives. And I think that, as a matter of fact, on actual policies, there are relatively few major disputes. I think it's paradoxically easier for Conservatives and Christian Democrats to cooperate across national boundaries, diplomatically, so to speak, than it is to be in the same political structure, because each side is demanding that the other issue and assent to declarations of principle, which they can't always do. If you don't do that, and you don't demand declarations of common principle when you're two governments negotiating, and I think that's why there's no reason why, across the divide of principle, we can't collaborate on 80% of policies very easily. On the narrow point of liberal democracy, I ran into Viktor Orban socially about a week after he made that speech, which I had read. And I said to him, you don't agree with that speech at all. I said to him, he said, why do you say that? I said, you mounted the case against the undemocratic imposition of liberal policies. And you called your situation, you called your argument illiberal democracy. It wasn't. It was opposition to undemocratic liberalism. Now, but I also pointed out, like Mrs. Thatcher's remark, there is no such thing as society, which was the opposite of what she was saying in that speech. Whatever you now say, the phrase illiberal democracy will be hung around your speech forever, hung around your shoulders forever, and that will continue. Orbán has several times since attempted to restate his position, and he ended up by the formula, which I think is about as good as he can get at this point, which is a liberal democracy is a democracy that doesn't inevitably elect liberals and pursue liberal policies. And I think that's fair enough. Yeah. But if we are comparing illiberal democracy in Hungary and illiberal democracy in the EU, the EU wins hands down in the competition to be the strongest, most illiberal democratic structure. Yes. And the movement against Hungary and Poland in this case is completely rigged. I mean, there is nothing in the treaties which they can cite, which the European Court of Justice can really cite to justify withholding funds on the basis of different policies of this kind. They're not mentioned. This is not offered in the treaties. It's offered by a legal dodge, by a court which has the obligation to always pursue the most integrationist judgment that it can in any particular case. So I'm not disposed to accept that kind of authority myself, and I don't think Europeans should be either.
I hate to put an end to this, but this is really all the time we have. Please join me in thanking our panelists.